My Pokemon name pronunciation video was personally one of my favourite videos to make, but if you've seen the video you'll notice that I didn't talk about any 6th generation Pokemon name pronunciations, since there aren't any 6th generation Pokemon in the Pokédex 3D Pro app. Well, because of this, I've decided I'm going to talk about some more name pronunciations, this time only focusing on Pokemon that are from the 6th generation. Now obviously, since there aren't any 6th generation Pokemon in the Pokédex 3D Pro app, we can't use that as a reference for these name pronunciations. We can look at the anime for correct pronunciations, but the anime might not be the most reliant source, since there are instances of the anime mispronouncing Pokemon's names, or pronouncing a name more than one different way. So this time, to look at correct pronunciations, I'm going to be looking at the origins of each Pokemon name. Names of each Pokemon are usually a mix of different words. For example, the reason why Mantine is pronounced the way it is instead of how it's spelt, being Mantine, is because the name is a mix of Manta and Marine. Bulbapedia lists every Pokemon's name's origins, so I'm going to be using that website as the main source for correct pronunciations. So let's start looking at some names. The first Pokemon's name we're going to look at is this Pokemon. Now, since Fennekin wasn't my starter pick for the 6th generation, I've never really had to say this Pokemon's name in my head or out loud, so for a while I didn't really know what to call it. At first I pronounced it as Braxian, but looking back at the spelling of the name I realised that was probably wrong. So because the spelling of AI makes the I sound, like with the Pokemon Raikou, I thought maybe it was Brixen, but looking at the name origins for this Pokemon, its name is apparently a combination of the French word for charcoal, braise, and vixen, which is a female fox, which is kind of ironic since almost 90% of this Pokemon is male. This would make the pronunciation Braixen.
Braixen.
I did find this pronunciation kind of weird at first, but I've managed to get more and more used to it over time. Next we have the Garden Fairy that for some reason isn't a grass type. So by far the two most common pronunciations for this Pokemon's name is Florges and Florgus. I've always preferred the pronunciation of Florges, but the name origins lays it out very nicely. It's a combination of Flora and Gorgeous, which makes the correct pronunciation Florges. Easy enough. So for this Pokemon, when I first looked at the name I immediately thought Skidoo. However, if you look at how the name is spelt, it's actually spelt out as Skidoo. This is made even more apparent when the origins of the name turns out to be a combination of skid and kiddo, which is a term used for young goats. The pronunciation in the anime is Skidoo.
That's why we start with Skidoo.
So that could be the correct pronunciation. However, I lean more towards the correct pronunciation being Skidoo, since that's how it's spelt, and that is what skid and kiddo would sound like together. Moving on, we have the most stylish Pokemon in the game. So when I first looked at this Pokemon's names, my first thought was Furfrou. Nice and simple. However, I then thought a little bit about the pronunciation when I saw that the second part of the name was spelt F-R-O-U. What else is spelt with the O-U spelling? And as we all know, it's not Raikou, it's
Raikou!
So maybe the correct pronunciation for this Pokemon is Furfrou instead. I mean, fro is a type of hairstyle, so it would kind of make sense. Well, the origin of the name is a combination of fur, obviously, and Furfrou, a word to do with decoration, which is actually very appropriate. So it is Furfrou. To be honest, I knew it wasn't really that hard of a name to pronounce. However, this next batch of names, not so much. Let's take a look at the Sword Trio. Firstly, we have Honedge, or Honedge, or Honedge. Okay, it's not that, it's either Honedge or Honedge. The origin of this name is a combination of hone, one, and edge. Wait a minute. This doesn't really answer our question. Is the first part pronounced hone because hone is part of the name origin, or is it just to do with the spelling? One is also part of the origin. So is it supposed to be pronounced as hon, as in one, and has the H at the front for hone? But then I could say the same thing for hone, having the word one in it. I guess just for this, we'll just have to look at what the anime says. So the anime also says Honedge. Well, that is the most common pronunciation I've heard, and even I pronounce it as Honedge, so I'm going to go with the correct pronunciation being Honedge. Next, I don't even see the point in looking at Doublade. I have heard some people pronounce it as Doublade, but we don't even have to look at this Pokemon's name origin to know that it's a mix of double and blade. No, the Pokemon that we can have a debate about is this guy right here. Hands down, the most confusing name to pronounce in my opinion. When I first saw this name, it was the first time that I had no clue what to say. The most common pronunciation I've heard is Aegislash, which is how I pronounce it, but I've also heard it being pronounced Aegislash. If we split the name up, we have slash and this word. How does one pronounce this? Well, I have heard the combo of AE make the A sound, like in the word. There is no way I'm using that as a reference. There we go. Gaelic. So like I said, it might very well be Aegislash, although it could be Aegislash. Well, the name Aegislash is a combination of the name of Zeus's shield, which is this word, and slash. So let's see what the correct pronunciation for this word is. Either Aegis or Aegis.
Aegis.
Pardon?
Aegis.
One more time.
Aegis.
Aegislash. This Pokemon is called Aegislash. That sounds stupid. I mean, I forced myself to start calling this Pokemon Virizion and this Pokemon Meanfu, but I am sorry. There is no way I'm pronouncing this thing as Aegislash. I'm pretty sure we all have that one Pokemon we purposely mispronounce because we know what the correct pronunciation is, but we just for whatever reason refuse to call it that. And for me, that Pokemon is definitely Aegislash. Ah, Binnacle, how I've missed you. Not. Oh, I'm sorry. Or is it Binnacle? Well, its name is a combo of bi, as in two, and Bonacle. So yeah, Binnacle. That was easy. Okay then, well, next we have Dragalge, or as I've also heard, Dragouge. This part of the name is spelt out as Gouge, which is probably why some people pronounce it as Dragouge, but it turns out that Dragalge is the correct pronunciation, since its name is a combination of dragon and algae, although algae can also be pronounced as algae, so maybe it's Dragalge, or maybe not, because that just sounds silly. So yeah, as I said, the correct pronunciation is Dragalge. Up next is the newest addition to the Pikachu ripoffs, Dedenne, or Dedenne how it's spelt. The name is a combination of Denki, which means electricity, and antenna, so Dedenne? Well actually it's the French version of antenna, which comes out as antennae, so it is Dedenne. Okay, so now let's move on to legendaries. Xerneas is very self-explanatory, however its destruction counterpart isn't so much. Because this is the mascot for Pokemon Y, and it puts quite a lot of emphasis on the letter Y, I thought maybe it could be Yveltal, but then thinking about it, this is the destruction Pokemon, so it would make sense if the first part was to be pronounced as evil, making Yveltal. The second part is supposed to be short for Talon, so Evil Talon would make perfect sense. However, it's not the traditional pronunciation of evil, it's the Middle English pronunciation, which comes out as Evel, making Yveltal. Okay, that makes sense. Well then let's move on to this Pokemon. The initial pronunciation I heard was Diancie, but the anime pronounced it as Diancie.
Diancie.
The first part of the name of course is a reference to diamond. However, so is Dialga's name and the correct pronunciation for that isn't Dialga.
Dialga!
The anime pronounces the second part of the name as Ancie, so the correct pronunciation could be the same as the anime with Diancie, but the name may be a combination of diamond and fancy, so Diancie, tomato is one of the two. And now we come to the last Pokemon we have time for. And what better Pokemon to end today's video on with none other than the newest officially announced Pokemon. When I first saw this name, my first thought was Volcanion. Looking at the name origin, the name may be a combo of volcano and lion, which will come out as Volcanion. However, its origin may also include canyon, referring to its ability to break large landmasses, which would make it Volcanion. The second part of the name may also be a corruption of canon, which would also make it Volcanion. Well, we know for sure it's either Volcanion or Volcanion. And I'm sure sometime in the future, whether it's in the anime or some other form of media, the Pokemon Company will let us know, along with all these other 6th generation Pokemon's names. So hopefully you learned a little bit from this video, whether it be you found out that you've been pronouncing a Pokemon's name right all along, or you haven't, but you just don't care because the correct pronunciation might just sound stupid. Or maybe one of your pronunciations for any of the Pokemon that I mentioned is completely different. In the end, whether you learned something new, or this was a complete waste of your time, I hope you enjoyed anyway. And if you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more Pokemon videos in the future. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.